Bernie Sanders made a big mistake in 2020. And this video is not to attack Sanders, so that's not necessarily where I'm going with this. But I am going to point this out because it's important in the context of us talking about autopsies and things that we need to, I would say, keep with us, but also things we need to leave behind as we pursue our political objectives on the left going forward. Talking about what Sanders did wrong in this race, talking about the things that the left needs to appropriate or, like I said, leave behind, is one of those crucial conversations that needs to be done and needs to be done honestly if the entire point is not political posturing, but to get policy accomplished, especially moving forward, seeing that Sanders has flamed out in this race. I want to point to two main ones. There may be others, but two main ones. It was a gross blunder for Sanders not to do everything necessary to win this race if he really was indeed terrified that Donald Trump was going to win. Meaning, if he ran this race with this notion that at the end of this process, don't want Trump to win, then he should have been willing to do everything possible in order to win. The entire point of a primary is to be competitive. In being competitive, you, during that process, through these fires of competition, discern the candidate that is most likely capable of dealing with the attacks coming from the opposition. By not doing that, he neuters the primary process, which means that as Joe Biden is going into the general election, you have no idea the level of attacks that are going to be leveled at Joe Biden and the effectiveness of those attacks, because those attacks weren't necessarily leveled in the primary, nor was Joe Biden inoculated from those attacks in the primary. You've created a situation where a person with the weakest record to go up against Trump, be it the grifting family members, the trying to cut Social Security, the putting black people in prison, the lying about civil rights. There is a litany of policies. The trade deals, there are a litany of policies to attack Joe Biden on if your name is Donald Trump. And in a general election process where everything is on the table regarding attacks, because Donald Trump, everything is fair game, and you have a candidate with an inability to be able to communicate and articulate his defense to those attacks, you have a uniquely bad position going into the general election. Meaning, if Bernie Sanders is indeed right and that he cares more about, let's say, somebody like Joe Biden winning as opposed to a Trump winning, then everything should have been on the table in order to make sure that Joe Biden didn't exceed this primary, because of everybody in this race, he is uniquely weakened against Trump. The second point I want to get to, and this is kind of goes to the point that the left seems to be compounding this very specific error, has to do with issues of power. And what I mean by issues of power, your pathway to attaining power. And again, assume for the moment that Bernie Sanders actually did indeed or prefers Joe Biden to win over Trump. And I have no reason to think that he doesn't necessarily prefer that. What is the best way to do it? Now, we ran this election process back in 2016 where Bernie Sanders flames out and turns around and browbeats his supporters to vote for Hillary Clinton. That didn't work at all. So why would you go with the height of idiocy and try to repeat this exact same process by doing the exact same thing without getting any political concessions for a candidate that is even weaker than Hillary Clinton? My point is, if your objective was to try to get Joe Biden over the finish line, then you do that by forcing and holding Joe Biden accountable to your policy concessions, the things that you advocate for that are absolutely and entirely popular, and you hold them to account to that. And you, to some degree, put a lightning rod around this notion that, look, if you want my people to back you, then you are going to have to give them these policy concessions. Because I'll tell you this, Sanders' base is more ideologically bent than many of the other constituencies within the context of the Democratic Party or that tends to vote Democrat. They are also the ones that are being squeezed and the ones that are left behind, especially if we're talking about students, where student debt, joblessness, this notion of them being at home with their parents, insurance that is tethered through their jobs. They want a fundamentally different world. And in the world that they're living in now, they are in difficult straits. They want something different. So putting up somebody like Joe Biden, who doesn't necessarily represent their interests, who's against all of their policy proposals, it will be weird for those people to turn around and back Joe Biden in that process. without getting any policy concessions, because backing Joe Biden in the process where he doesn't give you anything incentivizes your continued marginalization. And at some point, I would hope that burners begin to realize that. My point here is that if Sanders wanted to somehow sheepdog his people into the Democratic Party to vote for Joe Biden, the way to do that is not to come empty-handed. The way to do that is to be able to get some level of political concessions that juice the wheels and that incentivizes that population to go that way. Meaning, you push Joe Biden to get their votes, not go out and beg and browbeat for it. The left needs to be very clear on this, and it needs to take what it's been given in 2020. Because I would argue that the left has been giving something that many of the other constituencies over the years of the left didn't necessarily have. We need to accept that, and we need to move forward on that. And in this case, we need to leave behind the things that are not backing our interests at this very specific moment. And that interest being to get policy accomplished and to create and set a demand and to back that demand up in mass and to force concessions in doing so. This is no longer about getting any random Democrat elected. This is about getting our policy agenda, an agenda that we know is popular, an agenda that we know the majority of the population backs, to get that agenda accomplished and to force those concessions in lieu of being able to take power. That needs to be what the left is talking about right now. That needs to be the path forward for the left. You've done the same thing over for the last 50 years. It's time to do something different. Welcome to Late Night Soapbox. My name is Jamarl Thomas. This is the Progressive Soapbox. Guys, if you dig this content, please like, share, subscribe. You can always support PayPal, Patreon. I am going to keep this video to about 12 minutes. I want it to be digestible, and I wanted to keep it relatively short. Very basic point. Build upon what you've been given. You've been given two key things. I would say more, but two main things. The previous distribution of the left were continuously told that the Democratic Party and the left were working somehow in tandem. Yes, they would threaten you, they would browbeat you, they would tell you you had nowhere else to go, they wouldn't necessarily back your policies, and they would attack you on a whim. For some reason, it is your job to get their particular people elected, but nevertheless, you will back them because in your mind, if anything really went down and you had a candidate that would be up, that those Democrats will also back you. What you learned in 2020 is that they were more willing to get Joe Biden to stop Sanders as opposed to getting a candidate that would have been able to beat Trump. Meaning Trump in this situation mattered less. Even Chris Matthews postulated, hey, maybe it's better off to stop Bernie Sanders now and let Trump take this. Why? Because Bernie Sanders takes it for a generation. And a dominion within the context of the Democratic Party of these thoroughway Democrats goes up in smoke the moment that Sanders takes power. Now the catch becomes they were willing to take Biden because Biden, for the most part, sopped up the black vote, which was enough to stop Trump. However, this is a person who's being held on a rape charge or is being accused of a rape charge. This is a person who has a grifting family, so you can't even call Trump corrupt. This is a person who has horrible, onerous policies that are out of alignment. This is a person with like 24% enthusiasm. I'm making the point to you that this is a uniquely weak character to put up against Donald Trump. But again, that mattered less. The thing that when the jig was up was when Chuck Todd asked all of these other Democrats, are you willing to go to brokered convention if Sanders has more delegates but doesn't necessarily have enough to win it outright? And what did they say? Each and every one of those Democrats said, yes, we are willing to go to a brokered convention and tank the entirety of the party and lose to Trump. Because I tell you this, every last one of those Democrats know full well that if they rip that election from Sanders, that those Sanders supporters will not be backing that Democrat, and that Democrat will undoubtedly lose. They didn't care. It was more important to deal with Sanders and then try to get Joe Biden elected after the fact, being acceptable that Joe Biden loses to Trump. I'm making a point to you that you need to internalize that from the standpoint of the left, that you are not on the same side. You're not pulling on the same team. That when everything was down to it, Trump was more preferable than Sanders. And that's something you need to deal with because you are continuously hit by you have nowhere else to go by a party that was perfectly willing to go somewhere else towards Trump. The Labour Party in the UK did the exact same thing to Jeremy Corbyn. The politics between the UK and the United States aren't all that drastically different in regards to the way the neoliberals hate the left within the context of the party, the New Dealers. My point is, Sanders has flamed out. And in him flaming out, the left needs to be able to carry on and needs to take the lessons that A, we are not on the same team, and that B, despite saying you have nowhere else to go, they were willing to allow Trump to basically win it if it meant stopping Sanders. Which means that the left needs to be able to act appropriately in this situation and deal with it accordingly. Meaning, just because you no longer have a candidate in the race for president doesn't necessarily mean that you can't influence not occupying the square. The left needs to organize. The left needs to come together, choose 5 policies that are popular in the context of the nation and stand in solidarity on those policies, arguing that this is no longer a race to the bottom. Elections are more than just these instances. Elections go over the course of time. And in the same way, over the last 40 years, this country has slid further to the right because the left has not held its political leaders in the Democratic Party accountable. That stops now. We are no longer going to have a race to the bottom. This is about accountability. These are the policies that we want. We know at this point, based on the Sanders run, that these policies are popular. We know that the majority of the population backs them. Appropriate the policies. If you want our support, you will support Medicare for all. If you want our support, you will support an expansion of Social Security. You will support getting rid of college debt. These will be the things that you support. And stand by that. All of these lefty groups are starting to get more boisterous now in regards to, we're going to give demands. I will tell you this. A demand that doesn't have a consequence associated with it, a consequence of accountability associated with the demand, is just a suggestion. And in the political space, like the last 40 years, it will be ignored and you will continue to be marginalized. Your pathway to getting any level of political power, political leverage, political credibility, political accountability is through that pathway of this is no longer a race to the bottom. Why do you think your political leaders in Washington are so ineffective in the face of a crisis? Does it have anything to do with over the last 40, 50 years, they haven't had to do anything? You were willing to put them in office as a result of who they were not, as opposed to who they were. So as opposed to them making an affirmative argument of who they were, you were just terrified of the Republican. Year after year after year, you followed that particular policy of folding in yourself to the Democratic Party as if that was somehow going to get you what you wanted, and instead got you more and more marginalized. Why? Because politics is not about them giving you anything. Power concedes nothing without a demand, and in this particular case, you are not in power. You do have the potential to leverage power in this case. You do have the potential to assert yourself, especially since your leverage is your ability to make that party lose. But in the same way that the Democratic Party was willing to leverage that particular stick, you need to be willing to leverage it the same way. Yes, the Democratic Party may accept that Joe Biden may lose this race, but Joe Biden might not have accepted that he's going to lose this race. And your ability to get concessions from somebody like Biden, and they got to be credible concessions, it can't be BS stuff, is basically standing beside in solidarity on this notion that this is no longer a race to the bottom. Go do your job. These policies are popular. Do your job. You will function in our interests or you will lose. And when they cry and complain and bitch that you were responsible for Joe Biden losing, you scream, "God damn right. And we will do it again. This is what we want." We weren't fucking around when we said these are the policies that we want. This is not backing away from this. Yeah, these are the policies we want. We are no longer willing to have a race to the bottom. We are no longer willing to engage in the political process without accountability associated with it. Until you get there, and you're willing to deal with this notion of you have nowhere else to go, as opposed to cowardly folding yourself into the party, nothing will get accomplished. You will continue to get marginalized. You will continue to get ignored. Your pathway to political success, political power, is running a race unapologetically, where you are willing to do any and everything necessary to win that race because of the sense of urgency with all of the pain and anguish that you are running to solve. That is your pathway to political power, a certain degree of moral clarity and going after your opponent. Understanding that whatever buddy or friendship or whatever relationship you have with that person matters less to getting your political agenda accomplished, because this is an issue of power and that matters more. The left needs to understand that. But that's also true when you're not in power and you have the capacity to leverage power, being willing to do what's necessary. The Lefties love unions. Well, here's a situation where you have a negotiation between two inequitable powers. It's the only difference is now you're on the line. Are you willing to do what is necessary to try to get political concessions? Or will you continue to be marginalized and ignored? If you're willing to acquiesce and vote for a person who in no way backs your policy agenda, then they have no reason to listen to you at all. You have basically given over all of your power, all of your leverage, and you have lost that much more credibility in the political process. Do something different. Like, share, subscribe. Hashtag Green Splinter Mana Talk. It is 420 after all. Blaze one if you got one. Like, share, subscribe. Thanks all.